Welcome to Country Over Self, Defining Moments in American History. Each episode, we welcome a notable historian to tell us the story of a president and a choice that president made to strengthen the country without regard to the impact of that decision on himself, his power, or his party.
Welcome to Country Over Self, Defining Moments in American History. I'm your host, Matt Blumberg, and I'm here today with Richard Norton Smith, one of America's preeminent presidential historians and scholars. I could probably have Richard on this show to talk about any large number of presidents about whom he's either written or run their libraries and museums: Lincoln, Hoover, Eisenhower, Reagan, Ford, probably others. But for today, Richard is the award-winning author and editor of 10 books, including An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford. Richard, welcome to Country Over Self. It is truly an honor to talk to you.
Well, thank you very much.
So today we want to talk about our 38th president, Gerald R. Ford. I'd also love to talk a little bit about his wife, Betty Ford. And you are uniquely qualified to do that. I believe you gave the eulogy or a eulogy at each of their funerals, in addition to writing about them. Ford, of course, was a
two very different things, by the way.
Two very different things.
We find out a eulogy bears almost no resemblance to an honest biography.
Fair enough. So Ford, of course, was a very unique president in that he was the only president that was never elected to either the presidency or the vice presidency. He was appointed to the office of vice president by Nixon after Nixon's vice president Agnew resigned. He assumed the office of president after Nixon himself resigned amidst the turbulence of Watergate. Ford was very well liked by people on both sides of the aisle, very well regarded as forthright and honest as minority leader of the House. And with regard to our topic, Country Over Self, I'd really like to zero in on kind of one main aspect of the Ford presidency, which is probably the most consequential decision he made, the pardon of Nixon. So I'd love to just start by you kind of setting the stage, give everyone a reminder of the context around that decision.
Well, it's certainly the most controversial action that he took as president. And the best evidence of that is 50 years later, we're still debating it. And we probably will be debating it 50 years from now. You have to remember, Gerald Ford, as you said, became president under a unique set of circumstances. And very understandably, most historians have dwelt, as most journalists did at the time, on the burdens that this imposed upon him, the fact that he'd never been elected. Ford saw another side to it, which goes directly to your topic. Ford thought he uniquely, among modern presidents, had never sought the job, which imparted a kind of freedom. He hadn't made any promises to get it. He didn't have any obligations. He initially, at least, wasn't thinking about reelection. So what that did was give him the latitude that very few presidents have to, in effect, from day one, in his own mind, put country over self. And the pardon is a classic example. 50 years later, it is fashionable in some quarters to criticize the pardon, suggesting that Ford, perhaps unknowingly, opened the door to misbehavior by later presidents. The problem with that is twofold. One, we don't elect our presidents for their clairvoyance. And two, you can judge a president by any criteria you want, but you can only understand the president and his actions within the context of their time. Gerald Ford spent 3 weeks in August discovering day by day how much he didn't know, how much greater were the problems. Because remember, he had no transition. He had no long conversations with his predecessor or others about the policy agenda or the issues that he might have to decide. He couldn't acknowledge to anyone that he might possibly become president On August 28th, well, for example, he had no idea on August 9th, when he became president, that the economy was headed south, that U.S.-Soviet relations were fraying, that there were a whole host of things that either he didn't know about or he didn't know in sufficient detail. And day by day, he is being, to some degree, overwhelmed by the realization that he's in this job that he never aspired to. And then he's spending 25% of his time on the problems of one man. Call it naive. Ford could be naive. He was unprepared for the extent to which, for example, the national media and therefore the national conversation continued to be preoccupied with Richard Nixon, his tapes, his papers, his legal prospects.
Right.
And this came to a head on August 28th. He has his first full-scale press conference because he's been dealing with the economy and Soviet relations, et cetera, et cetera. He naively assumes that that's what the press is going to want to talk about. And of course, the press wanted to talk about Richard Nixon.
Right.
Ford left that press conference unhappy with himself. He thought he hadn't handled it well, that he had given contradictory answers, and he had. He went back to the Oval Office, and I think he was leaning by process of elimination, if nothing else, toward a pardon. But I think the decision was taken that afternoon. He called in Phil Buchan, who was his White House counselor, but more than that, his oldest friend, former law partner in Grand Rapids, and others. And he said something very Fordian. He talked about the burden that Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor, was uniquely carrying. He would be the man, in effect, who would decide whether or not to prosecute Nixon. And he thought that was unfair. And he would relieve Leon Jaworski of that burden. He said, if my conscience tells me this is right, I should listen to my conscience. I've listened to it until now, and look where it got me. And Phil Buchan knew Ford well enough to know that he's made up his mind. Now, in retrospect, if you could go back, turn the clock back, you might wish that Buchan had argued a bit more. Not necessarily about the wisdom of the pardon, but the timing of the pardon and how it was explained and justified to the American people. In any event, it was decided, Ford was in a rush for a simple reason. He didn't want it to leak. He knew that if it leaked, it would vastly complicate the whole enterprise. It wouldn't necessarily call it off, but it would make it much harder. The problem with that attitude, with that need for secrecy, was that it precluded him from talking to other people, including trusted outside advisors, people like Mel Laird, for example, who, by the way, on his own, had his own scheme to try to take this out of Ford's hands and entrust it to Congress. So on Sunday morning, it was decided he had sent a member of his staff out to talk to Nixon, ostensibly to get a statement of contrition, which most people thought was pretty weak. And again, Ford can be criticized for not. He said later on, if he changed anything, he would have held out for something stronger. It came as a shock because, of course, the country had not been prepared. Ford made things worse, arguably, politically, by entrusting to Phil Buchan, meeting with the press the next day, explaining, justifying. Here's where it gets complicated. Phil Buchan, a man of profound decency, very strong faith, was not personally convinced that a pardon was morally justified. Phil Buchan, on his own and without telling the president, brought his Grand Rapids pastor to Washington, D.C., and Duncan Littlefair by name, he wrote a proposed statement for the president to use. I don't believe the president used it, but it doesn't matter because Phil Buchan used it, and it emphasized mercy. And mercy was the overriding rationale that Phil Buchan, ostensibly speaking for the president, cited in justifying the pardon. Well, the country wasn't feeling very merciful in September of 1974. And Ford, who quite frankly had allowed this to happen, was nevertheless somewhat miffed because he thought, that's not why I'm pardoning him. I'm pardoning him as a practical, political matter. I'm not forgiving him. I'm trying to forget him. I'm trying to move on. I'm trying to change the conversation. I'm trying to prevent, he'd been told, backdoor channel to Special Prosecutor Jaworski, there'd be at least 1 year, could be up to 2 years before a Nixon trial could take place. Well, that would have consumed all of Ford's appointed presidency. And Ford knew Washington. He knew the press corps. He knew that the next 2 years would not be about fighting inflation or dealing with the Soviets or leaving Vietnam honorably. It would be preoccupied, defined by Richard Nixon.
You know, on the subject of Vietnam is an interesting one. I had forgotten until I just reread your book about the convergence of the earned reentry program for draft dodgers with clemency for Nixon, and how that set off that juxtaposition was not a good look.
No, and in fact, it's a great point. Because, again, understandably, 50 years later, we look at the pardon as an isolated event. Ford never saw it that way. Ford said very early in his presidency, again, to revert to what I said earlier, he had the luxury of not having to decide things based on a short-term political gain. And he'd been talking with his kids who were draft age, had there been a draft, and they were, among others, strongly urging him to pursue some kind of amnesty, conditional, otherwise, to try to begin to heal the wounds of this incredibly unpopular war. And Ford actually said that, I think I quote him in the book, that if I'm serious about healing those wounds, I've got to reach out to those kids who dodged the draft or who left the country for whatever reason to avoid the war. And that's exactly what he did. But being Ford, of course, he picked the hardest single audience. And again, there had been no preparation. He went to the VFW, 11 days into his presidency. And he didn't call it an amnesty. He didn't call it a conditional amnesty. He called it a earned reentry. Sounds like splitting hairs. But in fact, that's really what it was. It was an attempt to give people an opportunity through community service and the like to, quote, earn their way back. It fell to Jimmy Carter on the first day of his presidency to complete the process by issuing an unconditional amnesty. The fact of the matter is, although he got a standing ovation from that audience, they recognized courage when they saw it. They very quickly voted their disapproval of the policy. And I've always believed, again, we look at the pardon as an isolated event. Ironically, the morning of the pardon, there were polls in the Washington papers that showed Ford at the zenith of his popularity. There was a perception that the first month had gone much better than anyone had expected. He had a 57-33 lead over Ted Kennedy in a mythical 1976 race. Irony of ironies, many years later, in 2001, it's Ted Kennedy, along with Caroline, who presents Gerald Ford the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award, specifically because of the Nixon pardon. And Senator Kennedy, who says, President Ford was right, I was wrong. That's how, in effect, history had changed its mind.
Well, at least at that point in time.
At that point,
yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So, 20 years later, history never makes up its mind conclusively, at least about most things. And the pardon, again, is something that, depending upon the light in which it is seen, if it is seen post-Clinton, for example, because Gerald Ford thought the whole Lewinsky business cost us a year. And it validated in his mind his rationale that we couldn't afford as a country to take a year off from the problems we were confronting. But seen in Donald Trump's America, that people will put a different twist on it.
I thought it was so interesting that you pulled two quotes nearly right next to each other in your book. In the day of the pardon or day after the pardon, with Tip O'Neill saying this is going to cost you the 1976 election, and Barry Goldwater saying history will probably thank you for this.
And they were both right.
So when you hear, as you said, it's more fashionable at the moment for some historians to say, hey, this opened the door to greater problems down the road. What do you think of that? Like, does that ring true at all when you look at what's going on today, or even when you look at things like the H.W. Bush pardons of the Iran-Contra actors?
It's an almost unanswerable question in that I understand the rationale. My response, and I certainly don't dismiss it. On the other hand, I go back to my point earlier. Presidents are not clairvoyants. We elect them to make the toughest decisions, the decisions that nobody else can make, and then to let the chips fall where they may, and history would be the judge. Well, guess what? There is no single verdict rendered by history, as we've seen. It's as if the jury gets to vote over and over again. There may be new evidence, or there may simply be a new context in which the old evidence is reconsidered. And I think that's the process that's playing itself out. I would wish that if people are going to persist in seeing the pardon by the light of subsequent events, that they would also pause for just a moment on the Clinton example that I just mentioned. Because Ford's position always was, and as he got older, he never, maybe you would expect him, maybe some people would be defensive. He certainly never changed his mind about the pardon. And he felt that his rationale had been vindicated by what happened during the Clinton presidency and the whole Lewinsky scandal and the cost to the country. And if the theme of this program is putting country over self, I think Ford had a pretty good case.
When you think about his administration, is there another example that comes to mind of country over self?
Yeah, gosh, there's a number. But certainly at the time of the fall of Saigon, which he said was the worst day of his presidency, and it was humiliating to see the United States, after the incredible sacrifice of blood and treasure of 25 years, in effect, be kicked out of China. And again, like the pardon, he never asked for this, and yet he was the one who was there when the roof fell in. Congress, Senator Ron Nesson, his press secretary, told me the only time he ever heard Ford swear, the city had fallen, and of course Congress did what Congress sometimes does at such moments. It did not display an excess of political courage. Basically, it wanted to pull the ladder up and almost pretend that we'd never been there. And the problem with that was it left perhaps hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese allies at the mercy of the communist North. And Ford's position from day one, Congress reneged on a deal with the president to provide several $100 million specifically for the resettlement of Vietnamese refugees. As many people who we knew because they had been actively working with Americans over the years, whose lives were immediately at risk. So, the whole point of the famous helicopter airlift, which, by the way, was a fraction of a much larger ongoing effort to try, obviously, to get every American out of Southeast Asia, but also tens of thousands of Vietnamese allies. And when Ron Nessen brought the Associated Press wire copy saying that Congress had just basically reneged on the money, he said it was the only time he ever heard Ford swear. And he didn't stop there. I think it's the finest hour of his presidency. It certainly was not to his political advantage. But the fact is, there were a lot of people of conscience. For example, Pope Paul weighed in, the American Jewish Congress, the World Council of Churches, a number of Democratic state governors and mayors. So it was a bipartisan effort. And as Ford said, we didn't close the door to the Hungarians after the revolution in 1956. We certainly didn't close the door to Cubans fleeing Castro. And he said, damn it, we're not going to do it now. And he went on the air. It's the best example of Ford using the bully pulpit of the presidency to, in effect, shame Congress into reversing itself. And the first wave, about 125,000. And there would be successive waves later, all the way up into the Carter administration. But I think there's a classic example of Ford putting not only country ahead of self, but conscience above politics.
Just listening to you talk about this, it occurs to me that anyone that claims that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was the worst day in American history should probably do a little bit of reading about the fall of Saigon. Not that Afghanistan was handled perfectly either, but it's a different scale.
It is sobering to those of us who practice the historian's craft, how seemingly little we learn and how frequently history tends to repeat itself.
So let's pivot and talk about Betty Ford for a few minutes. And some of these episodes, I have an opportunity to ask some country over self questions about the First Lady. And this one is a great example of one. And I think, when people think about Betty Ford, just like when people think about Gerald Ford, they go straight to pardon. I think when people think about Betty Ford, they go straight to how public she was, both about her cancer surgery, which was almost like an emergency or at least unplanned operation. And then in the years after the Fords left the White House, how public she was about her addiction to alcohol and painkillers, which had been going on for a long time, but it wasn't until then that she was very public about that. And I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit and the insights you have into her decision to be so transparent with the public on those very personal topics. Like, is that country over self, or was she literally just, unburdening herself and almost following the 12-step program just very publicly, or some of both?
Yeah, I was going to say they're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
I always say that the two most dangerous words in the English language are either or. You got to put either or out of the whole conversation. In the case of the breast cancer, it was very abrupt, and it was frankly quite accidental. A friend of hers, with whom she was working, her assistant, in effect, had an appointment for a checkup, regular checkup. And she said, "Why did you come along?" And really almost on a whim, Mrs. Ford went. They went out to Bethesda Naval Hospital, and she could tell. I mean, the doctor obviously didn't give her a diagnosis on the spot after he conducted a breast exam, but she could sense something wasn't right. And she knew it that evening when a couple doctors showed up at the White House and wanted the president in on the conversation.
Yeah, that's never a good sign.
It's I suspect it is the conversation that every woman dreads, and no doubt many a husband. And there was really no time to waste. Now, classic Betty Ford. They wanted to do this immediately. Ostensibly, they wanted to do a biopsy to confirm their suspicions, if in fact they were confirmable, and then conduct surgery. Well, it turned out the next day was the dedication of the LBJ Grove. And Mrs. Johnson and the girls were going to be there and were supposed to have lunch with the First Lady and then return to the White House. And there was no way that she was going to miss that, or that she was going to inconvenience them, or equally important, that she was going to risk making that event about her. This was the Johnson family's day in the sun. And that's exactly what happened. And there's a picture, there's a photograph, extraordinary photograph. She gave them a tour of the family quarters so they could see how things had changed since their tenure. And at the foot of the bed, if you look really close, you can see what looks like a small suitcase. Well, that's exactly what it is. It was packed because as soon as she said goodbye to the Johnsons, she was leaving for Bethesda, and the surgery was good. Well, the test was conducted the following morning. In short order, they determined that, in fact, it was malignant. The president is back in the Oval Office trying to concentrate on a speech that he's about to give to a conference on inflation. And you can imagine his mind was elsewhere. But the interesting thing is, this was something the family discussed. It was very much a family decision, but there was really never any doubt that they would break with precedent, wouldn't be the first or last time, and go public with this information. But even they had no idea of what the impact would be. Mrs. Ford said, whenever she was sort of tempted after the surgery to feel depressed, she turned on her radio and heard these reports of women all over America in untold numbers who, inspired by her example, were going to their doctors for exams, were discovering this disease and were arguably saving their lives. And that obviously was a kind of medicine that you can't put in a bottle.
Yeah, and I believe one of the things you talked about in the book was that she said, get the news out while I'm on the table.
Well, no, absolutely. It's hard for us to, again, it's in its own way, sort of like the discussion about the pardon. 50 years later, there are all these things that we assume,
right,
that we take for granted. It's the norm because it's our norm. But the norm in 1974 was very, very different. The fact of the matter is, you didn't mention breast cancer in polite conversation. There were obituaries of women who died of this disease, and invariably it was referred to as a wasting disease. There were euphemisms. You couldn't say breast.
Well, one of the things I found shocking, I was doing some reading this past summer about George Wallace, And George Wallace, forget about his politics for a minute, right? He was term limited out of the governorship in Alabama. His wife ran. Lurleen, and she served for a couple of years until she died of cancer. And what I discovered when I was doing some reading about this was she didn't even know she had cancer. And so this is 6 years earlier or 7 years earlier than what you're talking about, not 50. She didn't even know she had cancer because it was the custom at the time for the doctors to tell the husband and not to tell the patient.
Exactly. That was the norm in the late 60s, early 70s. So you can imagine what a seismic impact this had. First of all, the shock that out of the blue, the first lady, this woman who we're just beginning to get to know for millions of people. And it's funny, I remember Mary McGrory, the columnist, who certainly was no political sympathizer with the Fords, but she wrote this wonderfully poignant and I think very true column in which she expressed surprise at her own reaction to the news, that she felt so emotionally moved by this. And she said, all America was sitting in that emergency room, that recovery room last Saturday when Mrs. Ford came out of surgery. And it's a great illustration, putting politics aside, of how modern presidents, first ladies, family members become, in a way, extensions of our own families.
Yeah. And when you think about the announcement of alcoholism and addiction many years later.
And that was harder. That was harder because and again, drug addiction being what it is, it's terribly isolating. And in the isolation, she was absolutely convinced that it would embarrass her husband. And that they couldn't possibly. And he made it very clear, it won't embarrass me. Remember, there had been an intervention. The only reason she was in that facility was because the family, and it reached a point where, quite frankly, I believe she would probably not have survived a year. It had gotten that bad. And it was a combination of alcohol and addiction to pain and other pills. She was taking 25 pills a day. And she's a very frail woman. I would say she looked deceptively, I won't say weak, but frail, because she obviously had extraordinary strength of character. And she was willing to do what it took, and the family was willing to do what it took. And damn the headlines, damn the whatever temporary embarrassment might or might not have accompanied this. It was overwhelmingly an occasion for people, of whom there were millions, who were in a similar situation themselves or who had a family member who was. And suddenly Betty Ford is unique among first ladies. She was a significant first lady, but historically, her real impact, her real influence, her continuing legacy, if you will, dates very largely to her post-White House life.
Right.
And above all, there's a marvelous story. Nobody would have predicted it, including the principals, in November 1976. But Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford became very good friends. But even more sort of unlikely, if you know much about politics, the wives became very good friends. And they used to lobby Capitol Hill together. They were a formidable team. Mrs. Carter, of course, would advocate the cause of the mentally ill, and Mrs. Ford on alcohol and addiction. And the two of them, they were formidable individually. They were greater than the sum of their parts. and the families, and that is now extended. The children are actually very close. So at this moment in history, when it is easy to be almost despondent about the degree of animosity, of savagery almost, that has infected our politics, Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, or the Bushes and Bill Clinton, they suggest that there is an alternative.
Or George Bush and Michelle Obama.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. I would love to move into our closing section, which is a few rapid fire questions. So as I said at the beginning, you could have been on this program talking about 10 different presidents. What would the next one be on your list? Like, what's the country over self president and vignette that was on the cutting room floor?
Oh, gosh. The first and greatest example is George Washington. And the mere fact that at his age, against his wishes, the greatest example of sacrifice, I would argue, in Washington's life was his willingness to come out of retirement and agree to be president of the United States, an office that nobody really had defined, that Washington would define with every action he took or did not take. And it was, he had hoped, interesting, he'd hoped to resign halfway through the first term. I mean, that's how reluctant he was. And you start thinking, if he'd done that, the job could have become a kind of prime minister. But he was dissuaded and convinced not only to see out the first term, but then, against even more reluctance, to agree to a second term. So, I mean, that's the best overriding, overshadowing example.
Right. So now let's do the opposite. And maybe let's set aside Nixon, because we've already spoken about Nixon. What's a poignant example you can think of a president choosing self over country?
Self over country? Well, I wouldn't call it poignant. I would call it selfish. I would call it self-serving. I would, poignant is a compliment. And I think self over any number of presidents who are regarded as failures, ultimately, probably a lot of the failure can be traced to certainly the pre-Civil War presidents, the Pierces and Buchanan.
Yeah. Were they acting in their own self-interest, or they just didn't have the moral clarity or courage or fortitude to?
I'm not sure you can't
separate them.
Divide them. I'll give you an example. Andrew Johnson, who could not outgrow the racism of the culture that produced him, unlike his predecessor. There's a reason why there's a Lincoln Memorial on the mall, and there's no Andrew Johnson Memorial on the mall. Andrew Johnson was outspokenly racist. He said that this was a white man's country, and he failed to learn the ultimate lesson of the war. All you need to know about Andrew Johnson is he didn't speak of Reconstruction. He spoke of restoration. He wanted to turn the clock back. In other words, he wanted to put the country back together, but he would have been perfectly happy, I think, to undo emancipation. Certainly, he didn't believe that the war had been a transformative experience in terms of race relations.
Right.
And there's a classic example of someone who put his own personal prejudice ahead of public policy.
Yeah.
And it's why it took 100 years for another Southern president named Johnson
to finish the job,
to make up for the first President Johnson.
Right. I guess not finish the job, but do the next leg of that.
Undo
the
worst of the damage.
Let's talk about Biden for just a minute. And I'm curious as to how you think history will judge his decision to pull out of the race, or too soon to tell.
The safe answer is it's too soon to tell. But in this instance, because of course we don't know what the next chapter is.
Right.
If, for example, Kamala Harris is elected on November 5th, certainly for the foreseeable future, it will be seen as an act of rare selflessness, and depending upon her performance in office, that will inevitably influence Biden's decision. I would answer it this way. It's hard to think of many instances in presidential history of presidents who were as sacrificial of their own interest, political and otherwise. To spend your whole life preparing for, aspiring to, doing whatever it takes to get this job, to believe that you've brought a lifetime's experience to doing the job, to believe, no doubt, that in his own mind, at least, that he's mastered the job and is doing it well. I do think history, more broadly speaking, and this is not unique to Biden, but I think more in Biden's case than the average president, is the discrepancy between, say, the journalistic assessment of a president as he leaves office and the historical reappraisal that takes advantage of the perspective of time, the access to papers and oral histories, and the sheer fact that you can compare this president's performance in dealing with the Middle East or the economy or China with how the next 6 or 7 or 8 presidents deal with the same issues.
Right.
But I think history will be much more generous in assessing Biden's significance. I'll let other people decide success. Those are the eyes of the beholder.
Right.
The fact that Joe Biden was a consequential president, the fact that infrastructure on a massive scale, the fact that the first significant steps on climate change. I mean, if you look into the future and you believe, as I do, that these are issues that are going to be with us for a long time, that it stands to reason that future historians looking back will at least recognize that Biden was the first, that Biden cashed in his political chips, his political capital, at a time of immense polarization, when it was next to impossible, we assumed, to get anything big and controversial through Congress. And I think history will credit him. And in many ways, like Ford, because Ford had spent 25 years on Capitol Hill, he knew what buttons to push. He was probably the most informed president since Lyndon Johnson about
I was going to say Johnson, yeah.
To make government work.
Right.
And Biden brought
Similar.
that same quality.
Yeah.
It's never a perfect package. You wish Ford had been a better speaker. You wish he'd had a charisma implant. You wish, et cetera, et cetera. And some of the same things might be said about Joe Biden. But you know what? With the passage of time, those stylistic issues tend to fade, and we focus, as I think we should, on the substantive or transformative events that mark a president's passage.
Right. All right. My last question is, knowing everything you know about our history, about our politics, about our system of government, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing to strengthen our system today, what would it be?
Well, that's simple. I'd restore the fairness doctrine, because so much of what's wrong with our politics today, where we've gone off track, is a climate in which divisiveness is profitable and consensus is seen as almost a dirty word. The fact of the matter is, in a clickbait culture, not only controversy sells, controversy has always sold, but a kind of conspiracy theory culture. And again, I'll be accused of terminal nostalgia, but I think there are a lot of people, not just my age, who harbor fond memories of the Cronkites and the Brinkleys and the Semirides, and the perception that they didn't always get it right. I understand cable and the desire to provide an alternative to, quote, establishment news. It was New York centric. It was Washington centric. All of those criticisms stand. But at their best, they understood that there was such a thing as objective truth, and at the same time, that a healthy regard for the other side's interpretation of the same information was part of their obligation as journalists. And that has had profound, malignant consequences for how we conduct our democracy.
I don't think you'll get a lot of disagreement on that point. Before we go, tell us about the new project you're working on, which sounds absolutely fascinating.
Well, it's immense. I made a career out of biting off more than I thought I could chew, which is why I write 800-page books. At this stage in my life, I've spent 60 years thinking about this subject and working for presidents and running presidential libraries. Anyway, so it seemed like now or never to undertake a comprehensive history of the presidency, which was also an opportunity for me to say where I got it wrong earlier, how I maybe changed my mind, to be a little bit more generous toward the Franklin Pierces of the world and more critical perhaps of some other presidents. In any event, the idea is there will be an in-depth chapter about every president, and they won't exist in isolation. Most every book that purports to be, in effect, an encyclopedia of the presidents gives you a slice. But what's missing is real life. So, for example, my chapter on Thomas Jefferson, Madison and Monroe are supporting players. John Adams, although he's out of office, is a voice, a one-man Greek chorus. George Washington appears as Banquo's ghost. I mean, the fact is, continuity is as much a part of history as change. In fact, arguably even more. Because back to what I said earlier, one way of passing judgment, if you will, on presidents is not only what begins on Inauguration Day, but how they address the continuities, the themes, the events, the geographical crises that run through multiple presidencies. And it's that sense of life being lived that I'm trying to inject into this book.
What's it called and when's it due out?
Well, I should say the working title is The Other Side of Rushmore.
I love that. And due out 25, 26?
Oh, no, I don't. I'll take a vow of silence. But as soon as I can get it done.
Well, I hope I can get in line early to buy a copy of it. Richard Norton Smith, best-selling author, presidential historian, storyteller extraordinaire. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you for listening to the Country Over Self podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a minute to give us 5 stars and leave us a review. If you have an idea for an episode or want to reach Matt directly, please email podcast@countryoverself.com.